Okay. Thank you, Leeza, very much, wherever you are. For a few years, I've been thinking about the problem with sunset, as in how time goes down in history, about our relationship with time and formations of historical time. Specific things in our lives push us to, or pull us to untether our belief in historical truth and realize it is but a colonial fabrication. The problem is when the things that happen in time are mediated and mapped as forms of power, which has resulted in the interconnected fields of art, art history, and curatorship in which I find myself in which perhaps all of us in some way find ourselves working within. I'm originally from this country. I'm going to give a bit of context in a way because I think there's less Southeast Asianists in the room as maybe other areas of Asia. So aside from our strong Singapore cohort. So I'm originally from Minnesota, and Minneapolis, and I've had the privilege of living and working from the contextual and geographic position of Cambodia for over 1 decade. I first went to Cambodia as a Humphrey Fulbright Fellow in 2002, and I was researching the nature of artistic practice in a so-called post-genocide or post-conflict nation, having been in South Africa prior to that. As well as to begin to fathom the scale of appropriation of the photographic archive from the Khmer Rouge era prisons. I taught art history and over some years became more of a collaborator, a participant observer, and then a practitioner. 6 artists and I founded a small nonprofit space for contemporary art called SA SA BASSAC in 2011. This is where I work from. This is where I direct the curatorial program and public program. Since that time. It is also from this position that my interconnected roles make me complicit in some of the mediating and the mapping of things that happen in time relating to histories of contemporary art in Cambodia. I am careful and I am strategic about this position as one that is responsive to artists in the local community and of local time in Cambodia, and one that resists history by complicating the approach to it while we are so-called making it. To superficially distill some context and to act as a really cheap historian, I want to give you a little bit more brief context of the most recent period of time. After around 100 years of colonization in the from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, and after a short experiment with independence by the former King Sihanouk from 1954, to over 2 million tons of bombs dropped across Cambodia by this country, to a US-backed coup in 1970, to over 90% of the educated class, including artists, being murdered during the era of the Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979, to a refugee crisis, a Soviet-friendly Vietnamese-backed invasion or liberation, depending on who you're talking to a full takeover by the United Nations, which is the only time in history that's happened in the early 90s, and onward to today's opening to neoliberal economy. So the post position, historically, of all of that has resulted in Cambodia's history being mostly authored by others, and through their methodologies. So in general, to access points of contact with Cambodia, the dominant positions are temples and statuary that have been iconographical studies, have been made into iconographical studies, and war trials that are officially mediated by and through international systems of economy, ideas of justice, and psychology. In terms of the arts, extremely rich cultural legacies across time periods are continually swaying between ideas of extinction and ideas of recovery, while infrastructures and funding in the contemporary arts is extremely limited. In our field, at its most respectable level, I would say even this level, we face the problem with sunset, the problem with these shallow access points of history. Many visitors researching for artists' international exhibitionary platforms often demand, yesterday the Filipino photographer, I don't know if she's still here, she was talking about this idea of re-victimizing And there's a high demand for re-victimizing and commissioning works that are looking back at the Khmer Rouge. So there's a lot of this. And then there's a lot of, there's a demand for rationalizations of Western art historical references so as to somehow legitimate the position of the artist practice. In many cases, these interpretations are not easily available to the visiting curator because they're not easily available to the artist. Because the artist's practices have been channeled from other inheritance. Most artists are responding to lived experience, and decoding is storytelling to very specific aspects of the everyday that relate to past and predictions of a future as seen or imagined from the present. Time travel as an exercise has underpinned much of my practice for the past few years in different ways. It was unconscious for a while, and now it's becoming more deliberate. It's a time travel about journeying to the past to access territories of the unknown, to decenter colonial forms of knowledge, in many ways through the colonial gesture of travel and discourse, yet without expectation to discover a truth belonging to the self, but rather not to have the answers. And we heard a lot about this yesterday. To observe or to pose questions as a legitimate position, and to do this in commune. To be able to answer by speaking around the issue and placing a hole where the answer should be and where the circle should close. Through a number of projects and collaborations, artists and I gently contend and complicate the passive and ahistorical colonial gaze of Indochine. We become more aware of how to work with the colonial infrastructures in the art world for engagement with them. If artists are indeed are to be able to pursue a career and livelihood as an artist, we must collaborate. Facilitating exchanges and building networks and breaking down gaps in understanding and the vast differences between the so-called centers and margins of knowledge production, the so-called withs and withouts, and the highs and the lows. To facilitate spaces that resist hegemonic language as a mother tongue, where artists could articulate themselves from the subject positions where they stand, where they work, and where they live, and where others might start to lean toward their histories, their stories. I turn, as an example, to one of many projects with such intentions, and it's called Fields, an itinerant inquiry across the kingdom of Cambodia. Because it was born at the same... I decided to focus on this actually instead of what you see, I think, in the brochure, largely because I just kept coming back to it, and that's because it was born at the same time as Field Meeting. I don't know where Leeza is. Right in front of me. It was born at the same time as Field Meeting, and in fact, I think they're a bit like twins separated at birth. Throughout 2013, Leeza and I had worked together on a visual arts program for a national festival here in New York City called Season of Cambodia, which the Asia Society and many of you in the audience helped to bring about with thanks. I don't think I have to say that national festivals are challenging for artists and curators alike, and we mitigated the foundation a lot of these challenges, I think, by resisting an exhibitionary spectacle and instead investing those resources in making a residency program. We had wanted to call this residency program Fieldwork, as in an inverse gaze where artists, not scholars, were put in the position of the field for their own kind of methodological research, as east looking west, as west had looked east, but with no intention to conquer. A rethinking or decolonizing of practice of fieldwork. So this project touched, I think, Leeza and I in similar ways, and prompted in each of us an instinct to facilitate more spaces that ask for some unmasking, spaces to find humanity and diverse context behind the labor in our field. So Fields was a 3-week itinerant, we know what field meeting is, so I turned to Fields. It was a 3-week itinerant program curated by myself and Vera May as a collaboration between St. Paul Street Gallery in Auckland, New Zealand, and the space that I run, SA SA BASSAC in Phnom Penh. There are many aspects, and I don't have time to really speak to these, but I just give you a general overview of Fields. It was a gathering of 18 participants from eight countries, curators, art educators, and artists, to find a means, excuse me, of walking walking together, or bussing together, or boating, or trekking, or swimming together, with a navigational turn to the unknown. What's nice about Phnom Penh and Cambodia in general is that it's impossible to get wrapped up in the art world. There's only a few nonprofit spaces, about 6 in Phnom Penh, a few else in other areas of the country, and 1 national museum. So we could be free from the contemporary together. We could be free from contemporary art, but be living in the contemporary for 3 weeks. We asked participants not to speak about their practice at all, and not to produce anything. Instead, we created spaces to live together, move through time and space together, and ask if we could stay there in a non-productive space. And it was not easy. The instinct to produce, for artists, for curators, to produce at least by writing a lot of notes or drawings. I mean, we didn't restrict this, but the instinct was really palpable. Our itinerary was packed with readings and meetings countrywide. We moved across so much of the country. From experts working with indigenous methods inherited by oral history and generational practice to others in fields who hover in speculative worlds. Linguistics, ethnology, archaeology, fields who look back in time, but all who have no definitive answer. And even if they work their whole careers for it, for example, a date of a temple complex or a set of beads or an extinct animal, their life's work can be rewritten in a flash with a particular technology, the arrival of a particular technology. I've seen it many times. Indeed, Foucault says that when one searches for origins, one indefinitely finds dissension. The mix of nationalities and languages and experience and knowledge systems was crucial to that residency. Through each other, we could access past in greater depth, but also greater nuance, to take on the generative aspect of multilateral translation in many senses, literal translation, but also experiential translation. Time travel here would take us only to unknowns, to live, eat, discuss, and travel with the same people for 3 weeks. A lot of us, never even knowing each other, even those knowing each other, never having been in these intensive contexts together. And I have to say, bless our funders, the Asia New Zealand Foundation, who trusted that such an experiment is healthy for contemporary art. And over the past 3 years, I can't count the number of collaborations that came from this kind of experience outside of contemporary art that has been then woven in the fabric in so many ways, including all the rest of my work, but all those 18 participants and so many things that they have done together. I'll continue with the second half of this talk by just very much for Leeza by performing something that I have read, that I have written, and now I'm going to read. And I need your participation on two moments. When you see a slide that has white gloved hands on a black background, I need you to clap. That's all I need. So this is from this publication from Fields. This is Fields in Khmer. This is Fields in English. I have hundreds of copies in our storage. If anybody would like one, contact me and you can order one for free. You just need to get it to yourself. What I'll read is, it's called The Problem is Sunset, and it's a fragmentary work in 6 untitled parts. In print, the words are alone, but for Leeza, I have added images to make it more dynamic. Okay. One day a Brahmin came, I should mention, sorry, all these images are coming from our travels. So a lot of them are mine and others are from the other participants on the project. One day a Brahmin came from abroad to a watery underground land. The land was a local underworld that had always been both cosmopolitan and transcendental. The land was conceived through sexual aesthetic of sexual difference. Male was to figure as figure was to ground. Female was primordial land, infinite in expanse. The arrival of the foreigner stirred the waters. Like many lands in the region of his original home, Brahman used a ruler. His critical spatial practice conceptually transformed the underground from amorphous to anthropomorphic. He measured the presence and absence of light. He carved a grid in the land. Right angles, cardinal directions, labored time. His descendants constructed and ruled the largest low-density pre-industrial city known to us for now. God kings, including at least one woman, spoke the language of sun, water, sex, and embellished stone. Non-God kings, not slaves, supposedly staple economy laborers, spoke the languages of sun, water, sex, and unembellished wood. For reasons not entirely known to us, there was a fall. We are trying to solve the transition between high to low, settled to unsettled, somewhere to nowhere. It's good that there are so few foreigners in the room today. Through the alliance of non-aligned countries, we have succeeded in making exogenous imagery forbidden by controlling the visual makers. As we know, decorative practices reflect everyday life. Do nothing but Cambodian art and do it in Cambodia. Do not share your tigers with anyone, or else we will face forgetting and being forgotten. The ghost of Bopana raised her hand. But are you not a foreigner? There was a gasp. Making an analogy between the present and the past is very dangerous. We don't actually know where Angkor ends. As a matter of fact, it could still be spreading. Managing what we know is a massive endeavor. To give you an idea, in the short time we have today, I'll walk you through 3 problems. One problem is the descendants. There are around 120,000 descendants of the God kings and non-God kings who still inhabit 114 villages within the park. We've made something called resilience rights for them, meaning we allow them to try and be resilient without owning their ancient lands. Pourquoi? Well, it's because we can't allow them to be indigenous contemporary. The expression of new vernaculars is simply not allowed. It would threaten the staging of the original, which is primary fodder for another problem, tourism. While tourism is the park's largest threat, it pays, so we do our best to perpetuate this threat responsibly through authoritative guidance. For example, we guide the tourism sector in handling yet another intense problem, the sun. Tu ne comprends pas? Well, briefly, we understand the sun is one of the most democratic programs in the world. We would like to keep people from considering its daily rising and setting as an event. We are making brochures to redirect their attention to the spinning of the earth. After happening upon a bunker later that night, near the center of the table with his wife passed out nearby, he dared to ask, "What is democracy?" One hand. Democracy is a decentralized and centralized infection, an internal and external disease. Another hand. Politics are too unsophisticated for me. Non-invasive practices can adjust mass historical consciousness. I am not looking to create enemies. I want to reveal them. Bopanna returned, how can you refuse if the enemy is you? And just at that moment, King Sihanouk's illuminated face in the moon began a charismatic lecture. He started, volcanoes are not native in Cambodia, but people develop them and live in their shadow. The banana stalks were hollowed like a tunnel waiting to be stuffed with the contents for our dinner. You've got 4 situations to choose from: the basket weaving house, the blacksmith collective, the medicine man, or the textile weavers. 15 different hands rose at different times. By morning, one was lying instead of laboring in the rice field. A few were drinking coffee with Charlie Chaplin off a red dirt road. The white lady bathed at the village water pump before the medicine man deserted to the forest. She was the first one of her kind to ever do this. Later again, we all stared at a man making knife. I go take fruit, come give you eat. Thank you. May I ask, by making this offering to me, are you building your merit field? Or do you really have intention to help me for my sake? There are 19 vital souls in the body. We live most of our life missing some because they escape. Through ceremony or intent belief, it is possible to reassemble the vital souls. Or is it? If we were whole, would capitalistic desire for ourself disappear? She answered, we are part of each other. Thank you.